The serrated edge of the survival knife didn't just cut the bark. It screamed against it. The sound was raw, a rhythmic scratch that felt like it was being carved directly into my molars. I watched, mesmerized and sickened, as the jagged blade bit deep into the ancient cedar. Fresh, amber sap began to weep from the wound immediately, thick and smelling of turpentine and rot. It looked like blood under the jaundiced light of the setting sun. Slowly, the hand holding the knife pulled back. It wasn't my hand. Not yet. But I felt the phantom ache in my own palm. I looked up, and my breath hitched in a throat that felt like it was filled with dry needles. Every single tree in my line of sight, pines, cedars, skeletal oaks, bore the same jagged scar. Thousands of them, stretching back into the suffocating gray mist of the Blackwood Preserve. And they all said the same thing. October 14th, 1994. I blinked, and the vision of the hand vanished. I was alone. The only sound was the thudding of my own heart, a frantic, trapped animal beating against my ribs. I thought I found a shortcut through the Blackwood Preserve, I whispered, the sound of my own voice startling me in the dead air. Instead, I found a graveyard of time. My name is Elias. I'm not a novice. I've spent the better part of a decade mapping the unstable regions of the Pacific Northwest, the places the Forest Service quietly omits from the glossy brochures. I like the silence. I like the way the world feels honest when you're 3 days hike from the nearest paved road. But the Old Cedar Pass was different. It had been closed since the mid-90s, officially due to unstable soil and frequent flash floods. Last month, a small, handwritten notice appeared on the trailhead board. Reopened. Proceed with caution. No official seal. No ranger signature. Just the invitation. I should have known better. The afternoon had started out normal enough. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that makes your lungs feel sharp and clean. The trail was overgrown, sure, but I could still see the ghost of the path beneath the ferns. But as the sun began to dip behind the jagged spine of the mountains, the forest shifted. It wasn't a physical shift, not at first. It was the light. It turned a strange, bruised purple, the color of a fading hematoma. And then, there was the silence. If you've spent any time in the deep woods, you know that quiet is a lie. The woods are loud. Birds, squirrels, the constant friction of needles against needles, the hum of insects. But as I crossed the dry creek bed at the 3-mile marker, the sound didn't just fade, it was deleted. I stopped, my boots crunching on a dead branch. The sound was deafening, a gunshot in a vacuum. I waited for the echo. It never came. The forest swallowed the noise and offered nothing back. Okay, I muttered, reaching for the Garmin GPS clipped to my shoulder strap. Time to head back to the trailhead. This vibe is officially rancid. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered, a glitchy strobe of white and green, before settling on a static-filled display. I frowned, tapping the casing. The map didn't load. The coordinates were a string of zeros. But in the bottom right corner, where the date and time should have been, the numbers were clear, bold, and mocking. 5:14 p.m., October 14th, 1994. Great, I sighed. The firmware is bricked. I unclipped the GPS to reset it, but my thumb froze over the button. I was standing next to a massive, lightning-scarred Douglas fir. At eye level, the bark had been stripped away. The wood underneath was pale, almost like bone. Carved into it, in letters 6 inches high, was the date. October 14th, 1994. I felt a cold prickle of sweat run down my spine despite the drop in temperature. I looked at the tree across the path. October 14th, 1994. I turned in a slow circle. Every tree. Every single one. Some carvings looked decades old, weathered and gray, the bark nearly growing over them. Others were fresh, the sap still bubbling out of the wood like honey. I felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger. Some local kids, I thought. Some elaborate, dedicated prank by a group of hikers with way too much time on their hands. But even as the thought formed, it withered. You don't carve thousands of trees in a protected wilderness area for a joke. You don't carve them all with the same handwriting. And you certainly don't make the sap run fresh on a date that passed 30 years ago. I decided then and there to forget the trail. I'd just pull a 180 and hike back the way I came. I didn't need a GPS to find the creek bed. I turned around, my heart rate finally starting to level out as I took my first few steps back. I stopped. The path was gone. 10 minutes ago, I had walked through a relatively clear corridor of ferns and young saplings. Now I was facing a wall. Not a wall of rock, but a wall of ancient, gnarled briars and thick, interlocking branches. They looked like they had been growing there for a century. The thorns were the size of shark teeth, glistening with a dark, oily sheen. I looked down at the ground. My own footprints were there, leading directly into the base of the impenetrable hedge. It was as if the forest had grown 50 years in the span of 5 minutes. I was trapped. I reached out tentatively to touch one of the vines. As my finger brushed the wood, a sound erupted from the thicket. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a telephone ringing. A tinny, electronic trill. BRRR ring. BRRR ring. I spun around, my hand flying to the bear spray at my hip. The sound was coming from further up the trail, deeper into the woods. It sounded like an old landline, the kind my parents had in the kitchen when I was a kid. BRRR ring. BRRR ring. I knew I shouldn't follow it. Every instinct I had, every hour of survival training, told me to stay put or find a way through the briars. But the briars were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wall was pulsing, pushing me further back toward the center of the grove. I had no choice. I had to move forward. As I stepped deeper into the Old Cedar Pass, the trees seemed to lean in, their carved dates watching me like eyes. The air grew colder, smelling of ozone and wet wool. And then I saw it. Lying in the middle of the trail was a single hiking boot. It was a heavy leather Vask, a style I hadn't seen in years. It looked brand new. The laces were tied in a neat double knot. I knelt down, my hands trembling. I didn't want to touch it, but I had to know. I reached inside the boot. My fingers brushed against a piece of paper. I pulled it out. It was a receipt from a local gear shop in town. The ink was crisp, the thermal paper white and unyellowed. Date: 10/14/94 time. 10:22 a.m. Customer, E. Vance. I dropped the paper as if it had turned into a coal. My last name is Vance. I looked up, and for a split second, the mist parted. At the end of the trail, nestled between two weeping cedars, stood a small wooden structure. A ranger station. It didn't look abandoned. A warm, yellow light was glowing in the window, and through the silence, I heard it again. BRRR ring. The ranger station shouldn't have been there. I'd studied the 2024 topographical maps of Blackwood Preserve for weeks before this trip. There were no structures in this sector, nothing but old-growth timber and the deep, bruising shadows of the valley. Yet, there it stood. A low-slung cabin of notched logs, its green-shingled roof thick with a carpet of moss that seemed to pulse in the fading light. The ringing stopped the moment my boot touched the porch's bottom step. The silence that followed was heavier than before, a physical weight that made my ears pop. I stood there for a long minute, hand hovering over the bear spray, watching the yellow light in the window. It wasn't the flicker of a fire or the harsh white of an LED. It was the steady warm hum of an incandescent bulb. Felt inviting. Felt like a trap. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded flat, robbed of its resonance by the surrounding trees. No answer. Only the drip 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 of sap from a nearby cedar, marking the seconds like a leaking faucet. I pushed the door open. It didn't creak. It swung wide with a smooth, well-oiled silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. The interior smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and something metallic, like the air right before a massive thunderstorm. The station was small, frozen in a specific, agonizingly familiar aesthetic. A heavy oak desk sat in the center, topped with a rotary phone, a manual typewriter, and a half-full mug of coffee that was still steaming. On the wall hung a calendar featuring a scenic photo of Mount Rainier. The month was October. The year was 1994. I walked toward the desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. The rotary phone was a dull, forest green. I picked up the receiver. There was no dial tone, just a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone breathing far away at the other end of a long, hollow pipe. Ch-ch-ch-a-a. Ch-ch-ch-a-a. I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle, my skin crawling. My eyes drifted to the center of the desk, where a large, leather-bound book lay open. The cover was embossed with the words, Station 7, Incident Log. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I turned the pages. The entries were written in a precise, looping script. October 12, 1994. Trail 4 blocked by windfall. Heavy mist settling in the basin. Unusual bird behavior noted. Total silence since 1400 hours. October 13, 1994. Investigated reports of ghost carvings on the Old Cedar Pass. Found 30 trees marked with tomorrow's date. Impossible. Likely vandals, but the sap is fresh. I turned to the last entry. The ink was still slightly glossy, as if it had been written minutes ago. October 14, 1994. It's not a loop. It's a stomach. The forest isn't repeating time. It's digesting it. I've seen the same hiker pass this window 6 times today. Each time he looks a little more like the wood. I think I'm next. If anyone finds this, don't look at the dates. Don't count the trees. Beneath that, in a different, more frantic hand, one I recognized with a jolt of pure electricity, was a single line. Elias is coming. I can hear his boots on the creek bed. I backed away from the desk, my hip catching the corner of a filing cabinet. A framed photo rattled on the wall and fell, the glass shattering across the floorboards. I looked down. It was a staff photo. 3 rangers stood in front of the station, smiling. The man in the middle had his arm around a younger woman. But it was the man on the left that made the room spin. He was wearing a vintage Forest Service uniform. He looked to be in his late 20s. He had a small mole just above his left eyebrow and a scar on his chin from a childhood bike accident. He was me. No, I whispered, the word catching in my throat. No, that's impossible. I was 10 years old in 1994. I was in 4th grade. I scrambled for my pack, desperate to find my wallet, my ID, anything to tether me to the real world, the correct year. I tore through the pockets, dumping my gear onto the floor. My modern headlamp, my titanium stove, my high-tech energy bars. And then, a small, laminated card slid out of a hidden pocket I didn't remember my pack having. It was a Ranger ID. The plastic was slightly yellowed. Name, Elias Vance. Rank, Junior Ranger Station. 7 issue date, June 12, 1994. I stared at my own face on the ID. It wasn't the face I'd seen in the mirror this morning. This version of me looked younger, leaner, but the eyes were the same. They looked haunted. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from outside. The sound of a heavy branch snapping under a great weight. I lunged for the window, pressing my face against the glass. The sun had finally vanished, leaving the forest in a deep, suffocating indigo. The trees were no longer still. They were swaying, but there was no wind. They were leaning toward the station, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, knitting together to form a cage of wood and thorns. And there, at the edge of the clearing, something was moving. It was a figure, dressed in the same leather hiking boots I'd found on the trail. It was moving with a strange, hitching gait, dragging its left foot. Every few steps, it would stop at a tree, and I would hear that horrific scratch of a knife carving into bark. I watched, paralyzed, as the figure stepped into a shaft of moonlight. It wasn't a monster. It was a man. He was wearing a red flannel shirt and a weathered backpack. He looked exhausted, his face caked with dirt and dried sap. He turned his head toward the station, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met through the glass. It was me, but it wasn't the ranger from the photo. This was the modern me, the Elias who had started this hike 4 hours ago. He looked at the station not with recognition, but with a desperate, dying hope. He thought he'd found a sanctuary. I wanted to scream, to tell him to run, to stay away from the yellow light. But my voice was gone. The Elias outside reached into his pocket and pulled out a serrated survival knife. He didn't look at the tree in front of him. He looked directly at me through the window, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he were looking through me into another dimension. He raised the knife and began to carve. I felt a sudden, blinding pain in my own hand. I looked down. A fresh, bloody O was appearing on the back of my palm, the skin peeling away as if an invisible blade were working its way through my flesh. The forest wasn't just catching up to me. It was rewriting me. The Elias outside finished the O and moved to the next letter. C. Stop, I wheezed, falling to my knees. The pain was agonizing. Please stop. But the Elias outside couldn't hear me. He was trapped in his own version of the nightmare, carving the only thing he thought would keep him grounded, the only thing the forest had taught him. He was carving the date. And as he worked, the walls of the ranger station began to groan. The logs started to weep amber sap. The floorboards beneath me shifted, turning from processed wood back into raw, living roots that began to coil around my ankles. I realized then what the logbook meant. The forest didn't just want my body. It wanted my timeline. It was a predator that fed on the when as much as the who. I looked back at the desk. The rotary phone began to ring again. BRRR ring. BRRR ring. This time I didn't hesitate. I crawled toward the desk, the roots tugging at my legs, and snatched the receiver. Who is this? I screamed into the mouthpiece. Through the static, through the 1994 interference, a voice answered. It was a woman's voice, distorted, echoing, but filled with a terrifying urgency. Elias? You have to get to the cellar. The red binder. It's in the cellar. If you don't find it before he finishes the year, you'll never leave 1994. You'll just be another ring in the tree. The line went dead. Outside, the Elias in the red flannel finished the T. He was moving to the 1. He was almost at the year. He was almost at the end. The floorboards didn't just creak. They groaned like a living thing being crushed. The roots around my ankles were no longer just wooden. They were warm, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic thrum that matched my own heartbeat. I kicked out, the serrated edge of my survival knife slicing through a tender green shoot that bled a sap so thick and red it looked like arterial spray. I scrambled toward the back of the station, the woman's voice still echoing in my skull. The cellar. The red binder. I found the hatch hidden beneath a moth-eaten rug. The wood of the door was different from the rest of the cabin. It was dark, heavy, and etched with symbols that looked less like writing and more like the patterns found on a moth's wings. I yanked the iron ring. The hatch resisted for a second, then gave way with a wet, sucking sound, as if the forest were reluctant to let me see its viscera. A ladder of rusted iron rungs led down into a darkness that smelled of damp earth and something sweet, like rotting peaches. I climbed down, my boots slipping on the slick metal. As I reached the bottom, I fumbled for my headlamp. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a space that shouldn't have been possible. The cellar was 10 times larger than the station above. It wasn't made of concrete or stone. The walls were a dense, interlocking weave of massive tree roots, thick as torsos, slick with a bioluminescent moss that cast a sickly, pale green glow. In the center of the room sat a single, iron-bound pedestal. And on that pedestal lay a binder. It wasn't just any binder. It was the color of a fresh bruise, a deep, angry crimson that seemed to absorb the light of my headlamp. I approached it with the gait of a man walking toward a guillotine. As I reached the pedestal, I saw the words embossed on the spine. Blackwood Preserve, Anomaly Protocols, 1994. I opened it. The pages weren't paper. They were thin, translucent sheets of what looked like dried skin. Protocol 1. The date is an anchor. The forest is a nonlinear organism. It does not grow in space. It grows in time. To survive, the organism must pin its prey to a specific moment. This is achieved through the carving. Protocol 2. The two Eliases. The organism creates a duality. The carver and the record. One Elias must stay in 1994 to maintain the anchor. The other Elias provides the fresh time for the organism to consume. If the carver finishes the year, the record is erased. I felt a cold void open in my stomach. I wasn't just being hunted. I was being used to feed a temporal parasite. The modern me outside, the one in the red flannel, was the carver. He was unknowingly pinning us both to this nightmare. I flipped the page, my hands shaking so violently the binder nearly fell. Protocol 3, the reset. To break the anchor, the record must confront the carver at the moment of the final stroke. Warning: if the carver is killed, the forest will default to the last saved date. The loop will reset. To escape, the carver must be stopped, but not ended. Suddenly, the cellar began to shake. Above me, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to slush. It was a scream, but it wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of 1,000 trees splintering at once. The ceiling of the cellar, the floor of the station, began to buckle. A massive root, thick as a telephone pole, smashed through the wood, missing me by inches. It wasn't just wood. It was covered in eyes. Small, milky white orbs that blinked in unison. They were all looking at me. Then the phone rang again. But this time, the sound wasn't coming from the desk upstairs. It was coming from inside the red binder. I looked down. A small, rotary dial was manifesting on the inside cover of the binder, the numbers shifting and spinning. I didn't pick it up. I knew what I would hear. The voice of the woman, whoever she was, wasn't a savior. She was part of the forest, the lure at the end of the hook. I heard a heavy thud from above. The carver, the other me, had entered the station. I could hear his hitching gait, the drag of his left foot across the floorboards. Drag step, drag step. He was heading for the desk. He was heading for the logbook to finish the entry, to finish the date. If he wrote 1994 in that book, I would cease to be Elias the hiker from 2024. I would become the ranger in the photo. I would be a ghost, a permanent resident of a year that had already died. I grabbed the red binder, tucking it under my arm. I had to get back up there. I had to stop him before he put pen to paper. But the ladder was gone. In its place was a vertical tunnel of thorns, their tips dripping with that same dark, oily venom I'd seen on the trail. "You can't leave, Elias," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the phone. It came from the walls. The roots were speaking, their vibrations humming in the very marrow of my bones. October 14th is such a beautiful day. Why would you ever want the 15th to come? The eyes on the roots all turned toward the tunnel. I looked at the red binder. I realized the protocols weren't just instructions. They were the forest's own map. I grabbed my knife and, instead of attacking the roots, I stabbed the blade directly into the spine of the red binder. The forest let out a literal howl of pain. The cellar floor tilted, the roots recoiling as if I'd struck a nerve. The thorns in the tunnel retracted, screaming like mandrakes. I lunged for the opening, climbing the slick, internal walls of the forest's stomach. I burst through the floor of the station, gasping for air that tasted like copper and old paper. The station was unrecognizable. The walls were gone, replaced by the dense canopy of the woods that had grown through the house. And there, sitting at the desk, was the carver. His red flannel shirt was tattered, his skin the color of ash. He held a pen over the logbook. He had already written, October 14th. He was beginning the one. "Stop!" I screamed, lunging across the distorted room. The carver turned his head. His eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were two perfectly round knots of cedar wood. "It has to be the date," he croaked, his voice sounding like branches rubbing together in a storm. "If I don't finish the date, the sun won't come up." "The sun can't come up in 1994? I yelled, grabbing his wrist. His skin felt like dry bark. "It's 2024, you bastard. Look at me." As our skin touched, a surge of memories that weren't mine flooded my brain. I saw a little girl in a yellow raincoat. I saw a car crash on Highway 99. I saw the moment the forest first spoke to me when I was 10 years old. The carver's grip was iron. He began to force the pen down toward the paper. The forest needs its anchor, Elias, the carver whispered, a single tear of amber sap rolling down his wooden cheek. And you're the only one who knows the way home. The pen touched the paper. The 9 began to take shape. The pen didn't just mark the paper. It felt like it was carving into my own retinas. As the carver's wooden hand forced the 9 into the logbook, the world outside the station's skeletal frame began to liquefy. The trees didn't just sway. They stretched and melted like wax, the green of the needles bleeding into the indigo sky. Look at me, I roared, throwing my entire weight against his arm. The carver's head snapped toward me with a sickening crack, his neck twisting further than a human's should. Those cedar knot eyes weren't just vacant. They were deep. I saw reflections in them, not of the room, but of the forest as it was 30 years ago. I saw a younger version of my father, his face tight with a grief I never understood, standing at the edge of this very trail, calling a name that the wind swallowed. Elias. In that moment, the major twist didn't just occur to me. It hit me with the force of a falling timber. I wasn't the modern Elias who had stumbled into a 1994 trap. I looked down at the red binder I still clutched under my arm. I looked at the carver, whose face was becoming more bark than flesh by the second. You're not me, I whispered, the realization turning my blood to ice. I'm the one who stayed. The carver stopped pushing the pen. The 9 was half finished, a jagged hook on the page. His wooden jaw creaked open. The forest, it doesn't like gaps, Elias. It doesn't like missing pieces. The memories I'd touched when we collided weren't just flashes. They were the truth. In 1994, a 10-year-old boy named Elias Vance did go missing in the Blackwood Preserve. The search parties found a boot. They found a receipt. They never found the boy, because the forest had split me. It had taken the child and saved him, preserving him like a leaf in amber, while a ghost, a hollowed-out version of me, was sent back out to live a life in the real world. That ghost was the man who had hiked in today from 2024. The man I thought I was. I wasn't the record. I was the anchor. I had been sitting in this station, in this year, for 3 decades, while my modern self lived a life that was nothing more than a long, elaborate lure to bring me more time to consume. The woman's voice on the phone, it wasn't a ranger. It was the forest's personification of my own mother, using the one frequency I couldn't ignore to keep the cycle moving. I've lived 30 years of a lie, I screamed at the carver. I'm not 10 years old.
I'm 40.
I have a life. I have. I tried to remember a single detail of my life outside the woods. A friend's name, the color of my front door, the taste of a meal that wasn't sap and dry needles. There was nothing, just the gray mist of the Blackwood Preserve. The carver let out a sound that might have been a laugh, if a tree could laugh. You have the date, Elias. That's all we ever have. He lunged. He didn't use the pen. He used his hands. His fingers were now long, sharpened stakes of ironwood. He drove them toward my chest, aiming for the spot where my heart should be. I rolled across the rotting floorboards, the red binder falling from my grip. The station was no longer a building. It was a throat. The walls were closing in, the logs pulsing with a feverish heat. The final confrontation wasn't just a fight between 2 versions of a broken man. It was a battle against the stomach of the woods. I scrambled for my survival knife, the modern one with the serrated edge. As the carver lunged again, I didn't aim for his wooden heart. I aimed for the logbook. If the date was the anchor, I had to destroy the record. No! The carver shrieked, his voice a chorus of splintering wood. He moved with terrifying speed, his hitching gait gone, replaced by the predatory grace of a starving animal. He tackled me, his weight like lead, pinning me against the desk. His wooden fingers dug into my shoulders, and I felt the scritch-scratch sensation again. He was trying to carve the date into my collarbone. See, the pain was a white-hot brand. My vision blurred. I could feel my thoughts beginning to reset. I started to think about 4th grade math tests. I started to wonder where my yellow raincoat was. The red binder, I gasped, reaching out blindly. My hand closed over the bruised crimson cover. I didn't open it. I remembered Protocol 3. The carver must be stopped, but not ended. I didn't stab the carver. I shoved the red binder, the forest's own law, into his open wooden maw. The effect was instantaneous. The binder began to glow with a violent, ultraviolet light. The carver's body convulsed as the protocols were forced back into the source. The 1994 he had been trying to manifest began to collapse in on itself. The station exploded outward, not in fire, but in a gale of dead leaves and ancient dust. I was thrown backward into the dark, the sound of 1,000 ringing telephones screaming in my ears. One more stroke. I heard the forest hiss. Just one more. I saw the pen, suspended in the air amidst the debris. It was falling toward the logbook, which was still open on the floating desk. The 9 was done. It was moving toward the 4. If that pen touched the paper, the loop would seal. I would be 10 years old again, lost in the woods, and the man I thought I was would be erased forever. I reached out, my fingers straining, catching the pen an inch above the page. Everything went silent. The carver was gone. The station was gone. I was standing in a clearing of stumps, the moon hanging high and cold above me. But I wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a small boy in a yellow raincoat. He was holding a knife. He was looking at a tree, and I realized the loop hadn't broken. It had just narrowed. The boy in the yellow raincoat didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his back to me, the small survival knife in his hand reflecting the cold, indifferent moonlight. I knew that knife. I knew the way the handle felt, too large for a 10-year-old's grip, a gift from a father who wanted his son to be prepared. Elias, I whispered. The boy's shoulders hitched. He didn't turn around. Instead, he raised the knife to the tree in front of him, a young sapling that hadn't yet been scarred by 30 years of anchors. If I don't write it, the boy's voice came, small and trembling. The woods won't let me go. Told me. It said the date is the only way out. I looked at the pen in my hand, the heavy, brass instrument from the ranger station. I looked at the logbook lying in the dirt at my feet. The date October 14th, 199 was written there, waiting for the final digit. For that would trap us both. I realized then that the forest didn't just want a victim. It wanted a witness. It needed me to agree to the lie. My dad. The heartbreak in his voice nearly broke my resolve. I could end his fear right now. I could finish the date, let him go back to 1994, and I would simply fade. I would become the ranger. I would be the record that the forest kept in its wooden heart. But I looked at my hand, the one with the bloody O carved into it. The O wasn't for October. It was a 0, a placeholder for a life that hadn't happened yet. We aren't going back, I said, my voice hardening. We're going forward. I knelt down and grabbed the logbook. With a jagged, desperate motion, I didn't write a 4. I crossed out the entire line. I scribbled over the year until the paper tore, until the ink was a black smear that looked like a void. The forest let out a final, pained shriek. The ground beneath the boy in the yellow raincoat began to heave. Run! I yelled. Don't look at the trees. Don't look at the dates. The boy turned then. His face wasn't wooden. It was mine, round-cheeked, terrified, and very, very real. He looked at me, and for a second the gap of 30 years closed. He saw the man he would become, and I saw the child I had lost. Then, the shadows between the trees rose up like a tidal wave. They swallowed the boy, the yellow raincoat flickering once like a dying candle before vanishing into the dark. I was hit by a wall of wind that smelled of ozone and fresh-cut grass. I fell, my face hitting the dirt, the world spinning into a blur of gray and green. When I opened my eyes, the silence was gone. I heard a bird, a real, sharp-tongued blue jay, screaming from a branch above me. I heard the distant, muffled roar of a highway. I felt the sun on my neck, warm, golden, and moving. I sat up, gasping. I was at the trailhead of the Old Cedar Pass. My modern pack was leaning against a signpost. My GPS was clipped to my strap, its screen glowing with a steady, blue light. Date: October 15th, 2024. Time: 8:42 a.m. I stood up, my muscles screaming in protest. I felt like I had been hiking for decades. I looked at the trail. It was just a trail.
No briars. No vaping sap. No ranger station.
Just dirt and ferns. I reached for my car keys in my pocket, my fingers brushing against something sharp. I pulled it out. It was a small, rusted survival knife with a wooden handle. It looked like it had been buried in the earth for 30 years. I climbed into my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I looked in the rearview mirror expecting to see the ranger, or the carver, or the boy. I just saw me, an older, tired man with a scar on his chin. I drove away from the Blackwood Preserve, the heater on full blast, trying to wash away the smell of rot and cedar. I reached the main road, the familiar sights of the town appearing through the windshield. Everything looked the same. The coffee shop, the gas station, the library. But as I pulled up to a red light, I happened to glance at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was ticking. 9:14, 9:15. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the 4th grade. I had made it. I was in the now. Then I looked at my wrist. I wasn't wearing a watch. I haven't worn a watch in years. But there, on my skin, was a pale, white indentation where a watch strap should be. And as I watched, the skin began to itch. I rubbed at it, and a faint, jagged line appeared. Then another. It wasn't a scar. It was a carving. Beneath the surface of my skin, moving like a slow-motion pulse, a series of numbers was beginning to form. They weren't from 1994. They were from today. October 15th, 2024. The forest hadn't let me go. It had just updated its records. I looked out the window at the trees lining the suburban street. They were swaying, but there was no wind. And as I drove past, I could swear I heard the faint, rhythmic scratch of a knife against wood, following me home. I made it out of the woods, but I think I left the right year behind.